Thank you for your beautiful music this morning, and thank you for your testimonial. The belief that all humanity is one will save us. Your last comment was powerful. The following stories represent points along a journey during which I very slowly absorbed the truth with growing awareness of the power and omnipresence of racism and its invisibility to those not negatively affected by it. The following stories, some embarrassing, some painful in various ways to me, show how easy it is to be absorbed by racism, how it affects everyone, including those who believe most earnestly that they are free of racism. I was born on the western edge of Birmingham, Alabama, at the edge of a little town called Fairfield, Alabama. And Fairfield was where my family's social orbit lived. In the census of 1960, there were 8,285 black people and 7,519 whites living in Fairfield. The black people who lived in Fairfield had their own schools, churches, athletic fields, and small businesses. These two communities lived right next to each other, but in parallel universes. Fairfield, to the west, was surrounded by communities that were predominantly white. The daily life of my family and everyone I knew was strictly segregated. Racism was an unquestioned assumption that did not need to be explained or justified. When I was 8 years old, on the first day of summer, I looked forward with great excitement to swimming in the nearby public swimming pool. For several years, I had burned with envy as I saw my two older sisters and older brother go playing in this pool, and I had to stand outside on the other side of the fence watching them because I was not yet the right age, but now my time had come. And so I walked down to the swimming pool, and to my horror saw that someone had emptied the swimming pool of water, and it was a huge pool, and filled it to the brim with sand. And as I looked through the fence at this site, a white man walked by me, and I reflexively said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, it was to keep the blacks out, because that summer was going to be the first summer where black people were going to be able to swim in the swimming pool." So I went home upset to a degree that I can hardly articulate, but I did not think, nor did anyone in my family say or think, as best I know, what it must have been like to be so hated as a group of people that a group of people would go to the long length of filling a pool with sand, an illegal act, to keep a group of people out. 2 years later, I'm 10 years old. And on the morning of September the 15th, 1963, a bomb explodes before the Sunday morning services at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. That church was 6.3 miles from my home. It resulted in killing 4 young girls and physically and psychologically wounding many more. This church had served as a meeting place, which everyone knew, for the civil rights leaders clustered around Birmingham. There was outrage in response, but I had a secret because I knew white men who had expressed outrage in their heart that I knew by the intensity of their anger were capable of doing this action. Years later, my friend and high school companion, Doug Jones, as the Attorney General of Alabama, brought those who had done this to justice. But at the time, it was a seismic event of shock and dismay. My father was progressive and liberal in his views about race and politics, and that saved me from the contagion of racism, at least at some level. My mother had more conventional views, but paradoxically, she within the household seemed to have different views than outside of the household. The story of race in our home would be incomplete without mentioning a person who worked in our home, which was common for the time, a woman called Mattie White. Mattie was a black woman who did domestic work in our home 3 days a week. She also worked for my mother's catering service, and for over 10 years, our family was the main source of her income. Mattie was married at 14, and she had 10 children. Her husband worked at U.S. Steel and was the preacher at the church that stood across from their home where Mattie lived. Each of her 10 children attended and completed college. Within the home, as I knew her, Mattie exuded confidence, optimism, a can-do attitude that was infectious. She was a confidant and companion, or so it seemed to everyone in the house. At age 16, I was assigned the job of driving Mattie back and forth between our house and Mattie's home. I did this for several years. Carrying Mattie home on those many occasions, I noticed that all the black houses were smaller than all the white houses in Fairfield, and that the land that their houses stood on were much smaller than the homes of white people, at least half the size, and that the streets were more narrow, and that no one had sidewalks, and no one had garages, and everyone had to park on the street, which made going into that part of town very crowded. Why did black people live in such crowded spaces? I was puzzled. I was troubled. But even though I learned a little more about racism then, I accepted it as the way the world was. In my sophomore year in high school, our school was suddenly, by federal edict, integrated. The white children, almost to a person, fled to private schools that were suddenly created. For a year, I went to nearby Inslee High School, which was in Birmingham. My history teacher was a black man who wore a suit and tie each day, spoke without notes, loved history, loved teaching history, and carried himself with great dignity. I noticed the dignity of his bearing, how he carried himself, and quietly and steadily affirmed his value as a person, despite living in a sea of racism. It made a deep impression on me. I learned a little more about racism. After a few months the principal of the newly integrated Fairfield High School, who was white, who lived near our parents' home, begged my parents to return me to Fairfield. And he prevailed, and I did. The school I returned to was radically changed, 65% black, 35% white. There was tension in the air continually. There were weekly bomb threats that we had to navigate around. The team was so deprived of athletes that the coach begged people like me to be on every athletic team there was. So among the duties that brought me into was being on the basketball team, which is an absurdity, but there I was. One time during our season, we played a basketball in Hueytown, Alabama. Hueytown is a very white, very racist place, or was then. This was literally, when our team arrived, this was literally probably the first time that black players had been in their gym playing a game against them, an all-white team. The state troopers of Alabama anticipated a problem, and there were 25 state troopers there hanging about. Several minutes into the game, a fight broke out between one of our players, a guy named Chip Carter, and the opposing team. The stands emptied. There was a massive fight and brawl. Our coach, who had anticipated a problem, had us run out of the gym. We went into a bus that was waiting for us. And then, as we were moving away, I saw through the window, as we left, dozens of white kids beating and screaming and cursing the bus as we were leaving. And a thought crossed my mind: they're not mad at me, I'm white. They're mad at my fellow students. But it felt like they were mad at me personally. And I saw the face of racism that was unfiltered and felt like a threat to me. I was learning a little bit more about racism as I was terrified. Years later, I'm a UU minister in Florida. I'm attending a training event about conflict resolution. It was sponsored by several big nonprofits in the city I was working in. The workshop leaders were two white Presbyterian ministers who had worked with Bishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa and had learned the art from him of conflict resolution. To this event were invited hundreds of community leaders. Mid-morning, we broke into small groups. We were instructed to talk about our experience with race. I was the first one to talk. I chose to talk about my experiences with Maddie. And as I spoke, I noticed that a black man across the table from me, about my age, seemed to be getting increasingly uncomfortable and agitated as I spoke. Per our group process, members of the group were invited to respond after each person spoke, and the young black man speaks first, and here is what he said to me. My mother did what your Maddie did. Let me explain to you what that was like. When she came home, she had nothing left emotionally after being nice to you all day. She brought her anger home after listening all day to your white people BS. and to the petty insults you didn't even know you had made. She had to suffer through listening to you and your people. And that tiny salary you paid her, which barely kept us alive, made her keep going back. It took a lot of suffering to keep you white people happy. Are you so self-satisfied now? I felt his raw anger. It began to dawn on me that everything I had thought about race was flawed, that I had used a system and gained from a system that disadvantaged others while it advantaged people like me. I learned a little more about racism that day. Years later, I am living and working in the San Francisco Bay Area. There I got to know 3 families who were all people of color very well. During this time, there was a series of stories about police shootings of black people that made the national news. These 3 families, because they knew me well, expressed their terror of what may happen to their children, their adult children, especially the males, if caught in the wrong circumstances. Their fear was visceral, powerful, overwhelming, so that in a number of cases, while voicing their fears, they sometimes became tearful. They exuded a raw terror, a helplessness, a powerlessness, which I had literally never known, but these individuals felt regularly. Again, I learned a little more about racism. Several years later, from that point, I had lunch with a woman, and you can show the picture now, who was one of the survivors of the blast of the church bombing I had mentioned earlier. Her name is Sarah Collins Rudolph. And for decades, she suffered from the physical and psychological effects of what had happened to her in silence. After years of struggle, she mustered the strength to start telling her story after many years, a process that helped her heal while inspiring other people to navigate their own trauma. The terror she had felt as a black person was unknown to me as a young person. I learned a little bit more about racism that day. You can take down that picture. Then beginning in 2016, I began to notice that white politicians affiliated with a certain political party in this country that had ascended in power were comfortable with abandoning democracy and embracing fascism. And at the core of the beliefs which animated this movement is the inability to embrace diversity, to cling to the ideology of white nationalism and white supremacy, that the power and allure of white supremacy would sway large numbers of people, including people in positions of great power, to forsake democracy, is something I found terrifying. And now I discovered that racism was coming even closer to me in a personal way and affecting my life and my family's life and the future of my children. Now white supremacy was affecting me in a more direct way. But what I felt so fleetingly is something that black people have known for generations. All of these experiences which I share with you, and much more I could share, led me to become convinced that white people do not understand the degree to which racism permeates our beliefs, our assumptions, our institutions, nor the degree to which the social, political, educational, medical, psychological, and physical lives of millions are affected by racism. When you are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. Progress has been made, but it is slow. It is subject to regression, and it is always fragile. I think understanding racism gets to the heart of what it means to live our faith and practice the worth and dignity of all persons. I do not often speak about this subject for fear that I might offend someone by what I say, or that what I say might be misunderstood and do more harm than good. And therefore, I am reluctant to say the kinds of things I say today. And sometimes, as a white person, I don't know what is the right thing to do or say. My posture then is to listen and to learn about my privilege, about the implicit and explicit bias system called racism that infects everything. I am a work in progress, yet I hope that over the years I have acquired some degree of awareness of racism, and I am grateful that our denomination has and is engaging its members actively to think about racism. Soon, members of our congregation will introduce the most recent version of Article 2 and other issues which explores this aspect of our values and beliefs.